Good morning. Welcome to the League of Women Voters, Door County, Eileen Bowen Speaker Event. We think you are in for a very interesting morning this morning. My name is Pat Szynski, and I'm a member of the current year's leadership team for the Door County League. In a moment, I will tell you about our morning ahead and introduce our main speaker, but first, I would like to tell you a little bit about the League of Women Voters and especially the Eileen Bowen Speaker Series. The League of Women Voters is a trusted, national, nonpartisan political organization encouraging informed and active participation in government. Being nonpartisan means that the League does not support or oppose any candidate or any political party. Our first priority is voter service, assisting with voter registration, working to increase voter turnout, and conducting candidate forums to help voters be better informed about the candidates who are running for local and state offices. Members of the League also work to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We work to expand citizen participation in the democratic process and to advocate for the practice of ethical good government. We study issues, we come to consensus over issues in forming policy positions, and then we take action. Today's event is part of our mission to educate. Now a little bit about Eileen Bowen, and then during the break, if you want, we have a lot of material over there and a little bit about Eileen. Eileen was a longtime member of the Door County League, starting in the 1960s. She was instrumental in many events of our local league, serving as its president and other important positions. When Eileen died, her family generously donated money in her memory to establish the Eileen Bowen Speaker Series. The fund is used to bring quality speakers to the county each year to discuss issues of importance to League. Eileen was very committed to a wide range of issues, and she worked hard over the years to promote good government. We're very grateful to her family for helping us continue Eileen's legacy. Now, we have a family member present this morning. Would you raise your hand? Okay, there. 3 family members present, thank you. So, thank you again for coming and supporting Eileen's legacy. We are also grateful to many people, in addition to the Bowen family, for making this event possible. The Crest Pavilion, of course, for use of this wonderful venue, the local media for publicizing this event for us, all the many members of the Door County League who have put various aspects of this event together and brought food, Laddie Chapman for videotaping this program, and our speakers this morning who are graciously giving of their time. The agenda for this morning is to have our main speaker's presentation, followed by a short break so you can reload those plates with fabulous goodies that we have provided. Following the break, we have several community leaders in a panel who will share their experience with our topic from a local perspective. After the panel, several people in the audience have also been invited to briefly share work their organizations are doing, which intersects with our topic of discussion today. There will also be time then for questions and reflections from the rest of the audience. Okay, so housekeeping things. There are restrooms near the stairs, clear back at the end of the hall. Please feel free to move about as you need to. And also, now would be the time to turn your cell phones down or off. This program is being videotaped, and there will be a link from the League webpage and the Facebook account. It will also be available on YouTube and on Charter Cable Channel 986, which is viewable by all Charter subscribers in Door and Kewaunee counties. We hope at the end of this morning you will leave with new information and a broadened perspective about how racial disparities in our state affect all of us. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Attorney Erica Nelson. Erica is the director of the Race to Equity Project, which is part of the organization Kids Forward based in Madison, Wisconsin. Previously, Erica practiced public interest law in New York City, representing low-income families involved in the child welfare system. Her Juris Doctorate is from Rutgers Law School. Excuse me. Erica's co-presenter, who was scheduled to be here this morning, Dr. Michelle Robinson, was unfortunately unable to come due to a last-minute family emergency. But I do want to tell you a little bit about her, because she was also very instrumental in the formation of this presentation. Dr. Robinson is the Research, Data, and Policy Associate for the Race to Equity Project. Her expertise is in topics related to race and racisms, inequality, stratification, diversity and inclusion, and racial equity at the city, state, and federal levels. Her PhD is in sociology and community and environmental sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She and Attorney Nelson work together with others in the Race to Equity Project, researching and promoting civic engagement with the goal of reducing the profound and persistent racial disparities that plague our country at both the national and state level. The League appreciates your willingness to come and the willingness of our panel guests later to present this important information. Thank you. Let's begin.
And making events like this possible. And as Pat said, thank you, Pat, too, for organizing all this. I know it might at different times have been a struggle because we're quite busy, Michelle and I, but we're very happy to be here. And as a disclaimer, as she said, I'm an attorney, so there's a lot of papers. There's a lot of shuffling around back here because I have to have many different versions of one thing happening at the same time. So just so you know. I often start my presentations with disclaimers, so that's one. And the second one is that I have a lot of information in a short amount of time. And not knowing you folks very well, where to begin, where to end, sort of where people are at with respect to these discussions. So bear with me as at times it may be fast, or we may not get through it all, but hopefully you'll walk away with something that you find valuable and important. So I'm going to try to stick this in here so that I can multitask my papers. Okay. So you saw this quote. James Baldwin is one of my heroes. And if you haven't read his work, I would highly recommend it because it's uncannily timely as well, if you go back and read it now to today's circumstances. So not everything in the world can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Oh, okay. All right, there we go. I'll try to sort of yell, but not quite. Okay. So as Pat said, I'm from Kids Forward, and this is our team at our annual fundraiser. And we work as an organization for every kid, every family, every community in Wisconsin. And we envision a Wisconsin where every child thrives. We also envision a future that is diverse, engaged, compassionate, equitable, inclusive, healthy, factual, and thriving for the future of Wisconsin. And these are some of the issues that we work on. Early childhood, healthier kids and families, equitable communities, strengthening Wisconsin's workforce, a level playing field on taxes, and a fair justice system for youth. This is some of where our policy expertise is in-house at the organization. So Race to Equity is a project of Kids Forward. And so I didn't know where to start, but I think the best thing to do is start where our story is as a project. in Madison and Dane County. So we released a report called the Race to Equity Report in 2013, looking at racial disparities comparing African Americans and whites in Dane County on over 60 well-being measures in education, child welfare, economic well-being, family structure, health, juvenile justice, child welfare system. And in this process that took us about a year of collecting data and conversations with the community, we had two major outcomes, essentially. And that was that whites in Dane County were better off, and blacks in Dane County were worse off. And that means whites in Dane County were doing better on average than whites throughout the state of Wisconsin, and African Americans in Dane County were doing worse than African Americans throughout the state of Wisconsin and in other cities in the country, like Chicago or Minneapolis or such. So there was this very wide gap in well-being and outcomes for African Americans versus whites. And we also realized that in Dane County, and I actually think very much throughout the state of Wisconsin, that there's a racialization of poverty. There is an assumption that that there's poverty associated with a person of color, essentially, in the state. However, that we also realized that the two things were, lots of people would come and say, well, there's a class argument versus a race argument here. And I'd say, actually, in this particular case and in our work, these things are inextricably linked. Like, they cannot be sort of divided and discussed separately from one another. They're actually really inextricably linked. And you'll see parts of this as we go through. So as a result of releasing this report, we had a ton of media attention, both nationally and locally. And I think the progressive intellectual county of Madison, Dane and Madison was actually struck by the disparities that were occurring. And it sort of shook our foundation as to who we thought we were in terms of a community, and how did this end up happening in this particular community. So there was a lot of discussion that took place and a lot of coverage in the media. Shortly after we released this report in 2013, another report followed, looked at the state of Wisconsin, that found that there was no state worse for African American child well-being than the state of Wisconsin. So, because one of the tensions we had was that I was doing this report, and then it wasn't, there were some inaccuracies, and there was a little pushback on it, and then somewhat, in a bad way, validated by the sort of overall ranking of the state of Wisconsin. So this is an example of the ranking. This is done by the N.E. Casey Foundation's Race for Results, and this was 2014, a ranking for child well-being in Wisconsin by race. If you look at the state of Wisconsin, this is part of our long-standing challenge. In the aggregate, we do fabulously. We are at the top of the nation on a number of different things, the top 10, the top 12. When you start disaggregating by race and ethnicity, we start to fall to the bottom in terms of the positives in these outcome well-being measures. So for African Americans, you can probably all see their high school graduation, poverty, birth weight, math proficiency, education, preschool enrollment, etc. Right? So these are the sort of indicators or data points that the Casey Foundation was evaluating states across the nation on, disaggregated by race. Now, coming back to Dane County, lots of people after these discussions about these racial disparities in the county started trying to sort of address the issue with policies both on the government, the private sector, the nonprofit, the school system, and so many, many plans developed in a way to try to tackle these racial disparities. We, in 2016, released our own sort of, collection of all the ideas of the different plans, and it's called Race to Equity, the Roadmap to Equity, a two-generation approach to reducing racial disparities in Dane County, supporting more parents to succeed in today's economy, preparing more young people to succeed in tomorrow's world. And I think this is really important because I think some of these principles that are in this roadmap are actually applicable to all of our challenges as a state, as well as, in particular, looking at addressing racial inequities within the state. And the two-generation approach, in particular, is important because I think that we oftentimes, and this is not wrong, but we get really involved and invested in youth, which is fabulous, and education. And we want to think that while they are the future, and that's where we cannot forget that many kids, all kids, in some form or fashion go home to a community, a neighborhood, families, parents, guardians. And if we can do all we want between 8 and 3, right, in the day and invest millions and millions of dollars, but fundamentally they participate in a larger community. And if that larger community is stressed economically, then in particular economically, then many, many other things fall apart. And you can't get what you need for those youth. So we really emphasize that if we're going to invest and think about policies, we not only need to think about policies that directly affect kids, but policies that directly impact their parents as well. So that's sort of the tenor of this project. So this is Race to Equity Project currently. We are doing a lot of stuff. So we are continuing to do our Dane County work and our policy rollout around the roadmap. We're doing more and more research and data that we disseminate. We have a community ambassador fellowship where we took community residents and paid them a stipend to take our information and our data and do what they needed to do on the ground with it to advocate for their neighborhoods and their communities. And then we are currently in the beginning of a process to replicate race equity in different communities, the Fox Valley potentially being one, as well as Rock County, in order to see what aspects of this can be tweaked to move things forward in different environments, right? Obviously, the state of Wisconsin is not the same or uniform all across the board. There's different communities, different histories, different factors. But how can some of these fundamental things move social justice forward? We're working on juvenile justice and looking at the racial disparities in the state of Wisconsin and how it impacts youth of color. And I have a report that we just released over here on the table about that. We do kids count, and then we're doing a lot of work nationally too, to talk to folks about how we went about this project. So I'm going to do, it's not my full strength or my favorite part, but I'm going to do a lot of numbers for the next few minutes, and then we can sort of digest why we're showing them. So this is the population for demographic population for the state of Wisconsin. And by the time 2042 comes around, the majority of our nation will be people of color. So if we want to start from the very basics about how racial equity or inequity, for that matter, affects all Wisconsinites, that is one, there's just demographic change, and it's a fact, right? So that's the population. This is, again, sort of Wisconsin's racial and ethnic composition. White alone is about 82%. Now, we're going to look at Door County's. This is Door County. See, I know, here's Wisconsin, right? And then Door County, one of the challenges we had in trying to bring data to these specific counties was that the populations of folks of color are so small that the data wasn't actually really available. So we have we have minimum. That's why I'm going to spend a lot of time talking mostly about the state of Wisconsin. So Door County is predominantly white, with the Hispanic Latino population the next most populous. So it's 94% white alone. Brown County is 82% white and 8% Hispanic or Latino, and about 2% African American. I'm about to share what we consider northeastern Wisconsin. There's a lot of different conversations around the new north and like this economic development conversation, and we're trying to decide what that really, like who is in the new north and who's in the northeastern region and who's in the Fox Valley. So this is our composition for the numbers of what we determined was the northeastern Wisconsin for the purposes of population. And again, still, we're talking about 88% of the population for the northeastern Wisconsin as white. Oops. Ah, oh no. My mouse fell. Okay. All right, and one of the things I touched upon briefly is that the roadmap to equity in Dane County, our biggest pillar is around economic well-being. Because economic well-being and home economic stability is a driver of a ton of different other circumstances in one's life, right? So for the purposes of talking to you today, we really wanted to focus a lot on the economy. So we're going to talk a little bit about employment, poverty, and the median wage. Unemployment rates in the aggregate for the state of Wisconsin have declined significantly, right, since the Great Recession, so those are natural, those are bound to happen. However, people of color were disproportionately impacted by the Great Recession, and so their rebound, is also slower, right, as compared to the white population. So while we think about like how low unemployment is, there's significant disparities in where that unemployment is, and much of this is the result of just coming out of the Great Recession. So I think employment levels for 2017. So this is a 94% fully employed, is the dark brownish red, so white, black, and Latinx, okay? But then you look at involuntary part-time, people that can't find full-time work but want full-time work. There's a disparity there, so there's more white folks are able to work full-time as compared to African Americans and Latinos, right? I think this is important because having involuntary, people, it's not like they don't want to work, they just can't find the jobs, and I think that's also indicative of how our fundamentally our economy is changing and how the economy works. So this is Door County's unemployment rate, and so this is white alone, and it's about 5.8% of folks in Door County are unemployed, and then let's see, the Latino number is about the same. And then, like I said, there's zeros for African Americans, Asian American, because the populations are so small, it's really hard for us to get those numbers. Brown County, this is, so this shows 24% of African Americans in Brown County are unemployed.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
back to that.
Yeah.
It said 2 or more.
Yeah, this is where the numbers are so small that they get skewed, right? So let's say there's, I don't know what the actual raw numbers are. Then it looks totally off the charts, right? So you have to be really careful in understanding this because, that's why we couldn't get you anything like school district numbers are really hard to get because it's almost on the school district level for Door County. You can identify the students themselves. So that stuff is not really available to us. So this is Brown County. This is northeastern Wisconsin. 18% of African Americans, 4% of whites alone, 2 or more races, and the Latino population for unemployment. In case you guys haven't, I'm sure you're familiar actually with the federal poverty thresholds, but these are really low. I mean, this is like it astounds me over and over, and I say it on the regular, but for a family with 2 parents and 2 children to have the federal poverty level in 2016 at $24,000, and then we wonder why there's all these circumstances where we're seeing them in other areas of our lives and our communities, because that's not livable, right? So I just want, remind people of that because I think lots of people forget. So Wisconsin poverty rates overall, 11% for the state of Wisconsin, and then child poverty at 17% for the state of Wisconsin. And then just the disconnect between these numbers and the unemployment numbers for the state, right? So there's obviously like something that is not working. So here are the Wisconsin poverty numbers disaggregated by race. 36% of African American people live in poverty, 28% of Native Americans, 26% of the Latinx population, 19% of Asian American people, and 9% of white folks live in poverty in the state of Wisconsin. Here's Door County's poverty rate. Again, super skewed, right? Because there's the American Indian poverty rate looks at 27%, but there's not enough folks for that actually to, okay, so part of me wanted to just skip it, but so people didn't get confused. But and then it's the same here. So African American population in Brown County poverty rate is 45%. So again, the whole point here, the sort of methodical going through each of these, is that there is a significant difference in looking at folks when you disaggregate by race and ethnicity as opposed to looking at the aggregate health of the state, okay? Again, here's the northeastern section. Child poverty rate for Door County. The white poverty rate for Door County for children is 12%, which is kind of, Hispanic, Latino, 13, 2 or more races, right? So Brown County, northeastern. And I think part of the issue here is when we think about employment, you think about what type of jobs are available, and then you think about the median hourly wage growth, right? This is good, right? But still, you're going to see that African Americans lag behind everyone else with respect to their actual median wage. Or, sorry, that's not true, the Black and Latino folks. So this is the median hourly wage disaggregated by race for the state of Wisconsin. Okay. These are the percent of jobs paying poverty wages by race. Okay, so almost, maybe 40% of African Americans, 40% of the Latinx population is working at poverty wages. Okay. This is the industry composition. So this is where folks. This is sort of a breakdown of where folks are working, right, and in what industries: manufacturing, retail, food service, long-term, home, and healthcare, right? And then, because I think it's also important to think about where folks are working and then what the wages are and how employed they are. This is all leads to whether people can sustain themselves, whether they can thrive, whether their children can thrive, dependent on how stressed they are by their own financial circumstances. Okay, for all workers, poverty wage jobs are those paying $11.55 an hour or less. Yeah. So, that's, you don't think that, you think, oh, that's pretty good. But I think this is why people advocate for the $15 minimum wage as a living wage, because you need to get yourself above poverty, right? Especially if you have 2 kids and it's a 2-person household. These are additional barriers for poverty wage jobs. Some of this may seem obvious, but I think, just sort of thinking about it in the context of the state, in the context of racial and ethnic backgrounds is really important. Part of the issue is that we're really seeing as this economy changes is that there are unpredictable work hours and schedules. So, I don't know, I can't remember the term exactly, maybe it's like on-demand jobs. But you sort of call and you see if anybody needs you that day to come in for a few hours. However, if you're a parent with children, you don't get to choose, that, I'm called the daycare place and say, hey, I'm going to drop my kid off for 3 hours and I only want to pay for those 3 hours. Like, it's completely unpredictable. So you essentially have to find childcare for the span of the week in the event that you get called in for a job that's paying, not enough for you to live on. So the needs of families and parents and children are not being met in many ways by this sort of changing on-demand jobs in this economy. So, and as this says too, it interferes with the possibility of having a second job, right, to make ends meet. Okay, so that's the economic picture. That was the Dane County story. Now we're moving into 2017, where the Ada Casey Foundation released another report called Race for Results, which looked again at the state-to-state comparison of overall child well-being in 2017. I believe we ranked 12th as a state. That was in the aggregate. But if you look at child well-being by race, this is how it breaks down. So if you look at I don't know how well you guys can see this, but better off with whites in Wisconsin, the index score was 762. African Americans in Wisconsin is 279. So again, it just sort of mirrors the same thing that we saw in Dane County on a smaller level, and then what we saw in 2014 for the state of Wisconsin. And what I usually say is that we're being pulled somehow on both ends. So the notion that a rising tide is lifting all boats is not applying in the state of Wisconsin, and certainly wasn't applying in Dane County, because whites do very well in the state of Wisconsin. That's why we get this 12th ranking. But so there's a lot of sort of thinking that we have to do about what that means to close this gap and bring all folks along with the prosperity, right? So this is going back to a 2014 number, but I don't think much has actually changed with respect to these numbers. So you just have to look at it, right? To see that there's something that's not quite working here. All right, so here's their other 12 indicators from 2017. This looks at high school graduation, the number of students based on race and ethnicity that are graduating on time, birth weight, delayed child rearing. If you look at low poverty areas, children who live in a low poverty area, only 30% of African American kids live in a low poverty area in the state of Wisconsin. So that's really concerning about neighborhood and community health. And then you look at degrees and family education, and who's above 200% of the poverty level, and preschool enrollment and reading proficiency. I think it's really important to note that lots of people sort of want to go back to these stereotypical answers for why things are taking place in the state as they are, and really the data in some ways sort of flips it on its head and undoes that, right? It's not about two-parent versus single-family households. It's not. And it's not about family education, right? Because we're doing pretty good on family education. And if you look at two-parent families for all across racial and ethnic categories, it's on par with everywhere else in the nation, and we fall below, right? So these things are not the answers to some of these challenges. Preschool enrollment, right? I mean, sort of the early ed stuff. So there's things that I think this type of data can help us pinpoint as we go along. And then I think I added this one in because I think this is important around the immigration conversation that we're having locally as a state and as a nation. There are 143,000 children in immigrant families in the state of Wisconsin, and 82% of them are children of color. And then children are considered to be in an immigrant family if at least one parent or the children themselves are immigrants. And then 91% of the children in immigrant families are citizens. Okay. So, but look, I mean, the total is 142,000 folks. Okay. So I think that's just important to have as a back frame about all these other pieces of the conversation. Oh my gosh, okay. So we have all these racial disparities in this state that I just described. And so people often say, well, what are the drivers, right? Like, why are we in these circumstances? And it is absolutely fundamental to acknowledge history, okay? There are circumstances that are structural, institutional, and historical that have, for hundreds of years, advantaged white folks and disadvantaged folks of color. That's slavery, bondage, segregation, discrimination, racism, as I said, embedded in our economy, our politics, our institutional practices. And so these historical factors continue to reverberate now. I mean, if I don't, redlining, what happened after World War II with the GI Bill. There are a lot of circumstances that created structural and systemic factors that advantaged white folks over folks of color. In addition to the explicit historical undeniable facts, there's racism that lies unrecognized in terms of our hearts and our habits. So that's unconscious bias or implicit bias, and then unacknowledged white privilege. And again, the looking at our systems and our structures and our culture and our history is actually really fundamental to sort of making progress and chipping away at some of these disparities. Okay. Ideas and solutions. There's a myriad of them that are possible, but I think what we need to think about is that race matters. It does. Place matters, where you're located, what the culture is, what the circumstances are. Class does matter, right, and thinking about it. What we do in terms of advocating for policy is fundamental to how the future looks. And then the culture of a place matters. Midwest nice matters, right, versus New York. There's all these different factors that I think we have to take into account when we're talking about how we address them and how we address. So culture does matter. This goes back to the 3 pillars, moving toward greater equity at the state and the local level. Enhancing employment and earnings, okay, this is improving wealth, home ownership, access to housing, a living wage job, supporting working parents. One of the things that we focus on is sort of getting more folks of color into living wage jobs, but that's a useless thing if they don't have childcare, they don't have transportation, and they don't have affordable housing. Oh, and we don't have things like sick leave and family leave, because what you do is you set someone up for failure, because as soon as there's a crisis or as soon as something doesn't work, they're only going to be in the job for so long, right? So we don't want to create a cycle. We want to have all the things at place at the same time. And that's really important for people to think about, is that don't think you can invest in 3rd grade reading improvements or 4th grade reading improvement and then do all the other stuff later, because this doesn't work if you're still waiting to get out of the gate on transportation, housing, childcare. You just don't get if you want to do it from a business case, you just don't get the bang for your buck in the investment here if you're not simultaneously investing back here. So supporting working parents by having the supports they need, the early childhood, and then for those same parents assuring their students' success in school. The 4th grade reading proficiency for the state of Wisconsin for African American kids is somewhere around like 24%. And if you can't, one of the things I always say, and I don't know, is that from 0 to 3rd grade, you get all the fundamentals that you need to learn how to read, your ABCs, your phonics, all this sort of stuff, right? From 3rd grade on, you read to learn. You have math problems, you have science, you have social studies, you have a whole circumstance in which your reading has to be ready and proficient and on point in order to absorb all the other information. And if we can't manage to do that for all kids, so that they're reading proficiently, then we're going to see circumstances where I would be frustrated, right? If I went into school every single morning and someone said, here, this is what you're going to do for the next 8 hours, but you don't actually have the tools to do any of it. But don't get frustrated. Just don't get frustrated. So I think there's all these things that we have to think about. So assuring the success in school is fundamentally important for the children of these same families these same parents that we're trying to support with greater economic stability. Because we want kids to graduate, we want them to be employed, we want them to stay in their communities. So one of the things that I often say is about the principles and the values to address our racial equity challenge. As I sort of described, there's a sense of urgency that I think we all sort of feel in terms of addressing this, because this cannot continue to be the status quo. However, there is no magic bullet. If there was a magic bullet, these circumstances would not be here, and we have to understand that this is a long-term commitment. We did not get here overnight, and this is a generational thing. This is decades long. So the idea or the notion that you can check a box and move on to the next thing is really not an option when it comes to racial equity in the state of Wisconsin or in the nation. I think it's also fundamentally important that we authentically engage the families and communities most affected by these disparities. Folks have lived experience that is even in qualitative experience about how these disparities manifest themselves in their daily lives, which is very, very important to hear and to understand. Because if you just look at data, you just reinforce stereotypes. You have to understand the different complexities that are in operation, and the only way to understand that is to talk to people, to listen to the folks, and then the best solutions about what works comes from the folks most affected by the challenges, right? I mean, I went and there was a juvenile justice panel of kids that had been in Lincoln Hills, and they literally pulled out a napkin and had 10 policy reforms that were more accurate, more on point than anything you had heard from the folks that study it. And I'm like, well, what are we doing when we have the answers right here, right? So I think listening to people is fundamental. Our systems need to be, and our services need to be woven together and integrated more. Things need to be more comprehensive and collaborative. You cannot talk about the school to prison pipeline without talking about police presence in school, or talking about kids after school time, or what they're doing in summer. And these are different systems that are operating. You can't talk about the juvenile justice system without also talking about the child welfare system. You can't talk about employment without also talking about child care, right? So it's really important that people both work together and within their lane and their power do what they can, right? But have the conversation, and again, the two-generation approach. So I think these are the fundamental values to addressing racial equity. Now, can you, oh no, all right, hold on. Okay, so one of the, I've played around with this last night. I was like, do I put this at the end? Do I put this in the middle? But one of the things that's really important to know about what matters is this is not a sustainable model for this state in the 21st century. You are not getting a thriving economy if you're going to continue to rely on the old way of doing things or the old, so this is sort of what making progress is in all our interests. It is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not like just because we level the playing field that someone's gonna lose. That is not how this works. Everyone actually benefits and thrives, and maybe if I could, see, I have paper for a reason. If I could go through here and find the last quote from Angela Glover Blackwell on, from Policy Link. So I'll read this. Making progress is in all our interests. Addressing racial disparities is critical not only as a matter of simple justice, but also for our collective well-being. Narrowing racial resource and opportunity gaps will help to level the playing field for all citizens, and in turn will make the communities we live in and surrounding areas a more supportive environment for high achievement by all of our children and families, including those of color. This is not only the right thing to do morally, it is a smart thing to do economically. Unless all our communities are thriving, the long-term social, cultural, and economic fate of our communities will be far less promising. A community is not resilient if it is not equitable. So that's sort of why I think it is fundamentally important to think, even though that may be the population of folks of color may be small, this is the future of our state and our nation. So I'm going to get a little bit more in depth. Race to the Polls is a sort of movement that we started over the summer at Kids Forward and are actually partnering in many ways with the League of Women Voters on this. And this is really, it's not so much a get out the vote as it is looking at how you think about racial justice when you go to the polls. What kind of things impact communities of color, and what kind of policy changes when when you're asking candidates or you're thinking about these issues do you want to focus on. So we have this vote. We did this vote postcard, pledge card, which is over here. And it was really sort of designed to highlight the different communities of color that are in the state. So in the background is 8 different languages of different communities of color throughout the state of Wisconsin. So that includes Vietnamese and Ho-Chunk and all sorts of different languages from different tribes and communities Hmong throughout the state of Wisconsin. So some of the issues that we thought were really important from a racial justice perspective is making Wisconsin healthier for communities of color, looking at the healthcare system. The uninsured rate for Latinx and Native American Wisconsinites is about 4 times that of white folks, okay? So how do we, addressing healthcare is really important if we're also looking at making people healthy. So make Medicaid strong, close the coverage gap, and promote policies that allow access by reducing premiums, and that's obviously an error, reducing pre-existing conditions, but you know what I mean. We do want to, hopefully we do really reduce pre-existing conditions by having a comprehensive, more accessible healthcare system. So we talk a lot about poverty and lifting folks out of poverty because it's disproportionately impacting communities of color, which impacts all other aspects of their lives. I just wanted to repeat this because I think this is really profound in many ways. And this is 200,000 Wisconsin children live in poverty. And then again, we have these racial disparities. So increase employment and income for low-income families. Expand the supports. This is supporting working families. Close the gender and racial pay gap because women are still not getting paid, and yet they're heads of households all across the state, regardless of color, and the pay is not equitable. And then advocate for equitable tax policies, such as expanding the earned income tax credit that advantages many communities across the state. Early care and education. This is looking at access to high quality education. So creating the Young Star 5-star rating, making it accessible for all kids is really important. Again, support the child care workforce, especially workers of color. Oftentimes, going back to the living wage, we have people taking care of our children who aren't getting paid a living wage themselves, or they're taking care of other family members for us, and they're not getting the living wage. And so how do we sort of show our support or expect people to be as loving and humane and less under stress as we need them to be, and yet we can't figure out how to pay them something that is supporting. Working to eliminate food deserts and invest in healthy, accessible outdoor space and age and culturally appropriate activities. This goes to early childhood education. Kids in these child care facilities having access to healthy food, healthy outdoor space, super important for brain development, as I'm sure you're all aware on how fast and important brain development science is telling us. And promote and invest in trauma-informed care. Really important to sort of meet the needs of kids and youth in particular where they're at, and oftentimes they've experienced some form of trauma, and how we approach that is really important. Protect immigrant families. and this is the case in Wisconsin too. We advocate for keeping families together because it's important for family stability and economic well-being, higher education, and then looking at removing barriers to driver's licenses and such like that, because allowing families to access and safely go out and feel comfortable by being able to go to the grocery store, go to their housing, go to their job, whatever. Driver's licenses for immigrant families is fundamental to that. And then this is really important to me. I think that we're talking about like sort of this juvenile justice and the child welfare system is often the deep end systems at the end of the pipeline. And with Act 185 and the closing of Lincoln Hills and Copper Lake schools, I think that the state of Wisconsin has just an opportunity to really do something differently for youth in the juvenile justice system. And right now, there is just a huge disparity for youth of color in the juvenile justice system across the state of Wisconsin. And we need to treat kids like kids and not like adults. I think we need to work to reduce the need for these facilities, for period. And that is one, by having more investment in trauma-informed care, more investment in mental health, more investment in diversion options for these youth, and then improve Wisconsin's second chance bill. Right now it's very limited in who's eligible to be part of the second chance bill. Currently 17-year-olds are adults in the state of Wisconsin. And so there's a lot of work that's been done to try to put them back in the juvenile justice system. But they've narrowed it, so the only folks that are eligible to go back into the juvenile justice system are those that are nonviolent crime, considered nonviolent crimes, and that's a very small amount of folks. And when you have racial profiling and all sorts of things, what happens is, even though white kids are also committing violent crimes, African American and Latino kids are getting sort of tried and arrested more frequently and disproportionately than their white counterparts for those violent crimes. So what you really do is you create a system where white kids go to the juvenile justice system and you continue to leave kids of color out of it, right? So it's like how we need to be full, encompassing, and honest about what we're doing when we think about reform. So I am hopeful that we will have an opportunity to take the closing of Lincoln Hills and the conversation around juvenile justice and really create it into something new, something forward-thinking, something that addresses youth needs, and then give youth a voice, which is sort of what I was talking about before. You know, they're the ones that know what they need. This is sort of talking about how we engage with the various communities across the state on this effort to have people think about policy issues with a racial equity lens. We have a series of issue briefs on all these issues that go through all the data and the recommendations on racetothepolls.org. And so we worked with a number of folks to distribute it to their different communities. And one of the wonderful things we did too was the League of Conservation Voters has a native vote program. And we partnered with them to distribute these voter pledge cards in all the tribal languages throughout the state. So that's what, it's like Potawatomi, Mohegan, there's just a huge number of, and that was a really wonderful opportunity, right? Because it's very much focusing on a population in the state of Wisconsin that is often completely left out of the conversation and ignored. And so getting out the vote to the Native communities and is really, really important, and has been something that we're really proud of as a partnership. Oh, how did they get twisted? End of slideshow. No, okay. So that, so I wanted to end there because I think this is a very hopeful thing about how we can partner to improve the circumstances for communities of color across the state. And I also want to say that while things often, from my perspective, and maybe from yours as well, hearing this presentation, are overwhelming, but I don't think it's impossible. I actually wouldn't be here if I thought that this was all not a possibility for our future. And with every day that goes by, I have 2 young kids, almost 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, and it was urgent before, and now it becomes daily more and more urgent, and that requires hope, and that also requires everyone sort of saying, you know what, like, I don't run something, people need to find their lane and say, I have power in my conversations, I have power in my groups, I have power in my book group, whatever it may be, and then understand how to articulate that, and then have faith that the person next to you is doing that same conversation, or reviewing their HR policies when they go back to work, or thinking about how they can do something differently with a racial equity lens. And if we have faith and we ask each other to do that, then I think it becomes less overwhelming, right? There's no expectation that one person is going to have the answers or do all of this on their own, but rather that each individual takes on something. So I hope this was helpful and informative. So thank you very much for your time and for welcoming me. Oh, I'm early.